Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Cloud Bytes Conversations. Thank you so much for joining, and Happy New Year, as this is the first one of our new year. I'm really, really pleased to share that I have someone who I've done a lot of work with recently, but have known for a long time. In fact, off air just before this, we were trying to work out how long, and failed miserably at that. But it is the one and the only Peter Chittum. So, welcome to the podcast, Pete.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks very much. Appreciate you having me.
No, happy to. I mean, you are the person I think who has appeared more on this kind of, so we record the podcast and like the live streams, everything with a StreamYard, and I think you are just as comfortable in this thing as I am. I was doing something with someone the other week and they were like, have you ever used StreamYard? I was like, I feel like I live in there at the moment.
It's the modern version of during the pandemic when we all just basically lived in Zoom meetings.
Yeah, exactly. And it was one of those kind of following on from that, where you and I have been on so many videos and live streams and things recently. It was this was one of the easier ones to prepare for, because it's like, oh yeah, chatting to Pete for an hour is going to be. I mean, yeah, we hardly break a sweat. Normally we do 2 hours, and like, oh crap, we gotta wrap up quick.
I mean, like we have to stop ourselves from our prep talk before the live stream to, it's like, okay, we got to cut it off here so we actually go and actually get on and like live stream. So yeah.
Yes. And then the first 20 minutes of the live stream is then us getting degenerated into talking about books or Marvel films or some nonsense anyway. So we're not going to do that on this one. We're going to be behaved on this one. So,
okay. All right.
Peter, I mean, I'm pretty sure that everyone who's listening will know who you are, but can you give us a little bit of an intro to yourself and tell us about how you got started out in technology?
Yeah, so my name is Peter Chittum. I've been around the Salesforce world for I think back nearly 15 years. And my roles have been primarily with Salesforce. Initially, I was a technical instructor and I taught the the Dev 401 training, which was basically all of the customization with clicks stuff plus Visualforce. And then Dev 501 training, which was all of the customization with Apex plus Apex and Visualforce. I also taught what we at the time called Dev 531, and I think it's been rebranded as an admin training now, but it was teaching admins how to write Apex. It was really object-oriented programming basics, but using Apex. And then I started to dabble in doing the integration training that we had before I moved off and went into the world of developer relations, where initially I was a developer evangelist and then went on to do leadership, first in EMEA, leading the developer evangelist team here. I led the whole developer relations team for about a year, and then I finished off my time. I was about 3 years where I was leading the entire developer advocate team for EMEA and North America. So I kind of nicknamed my team the transatlantic team. So I had folks on each side, basically. So that's kind of how people would know me, because through that, I've done lots of videos. I have spoken at countless Salesforce conferences, Salesforce community conferences, developer groups, admin groups even. So I tried to get around there. I was also very active in some of the online communities that exist, particularly Salesforce Stack Exchange. I was pretty active. There was an IIRC, so an Internet Relay Chat.
Wow.
That was a part
I don't think I ever knew about that one.
Oh, yeah. So did you ever see the Daryl Shaber Twitter handle?
Yep.
Yeah. So like,
were you Daryl Shaber? Is this the big
I don't know
reveal?
who Daryl Shaber is or was. I think I've heard like there've been some.
My guess was always Gary Plummeter.
I don't think it was him, but I think it was definitely somebody associated with the Internet Relay Chat folks. So, And what was the other big online community I was part of? Oh, for I'm not as active now on any of those really, but uh, the Good Day Sir podcast
Yes.
community. I one of the things I one of the roles I tried to play being one of the internal people, and I think initially I was the only Salesforce employee who was on that community, is I actively tried to recruit other Salesforce employees who were part of product and technology to participate in there. So I think I had you know, I may not have been the only one because I know uh, Shane McGowan, um, he is also pretty active there, and he may have been on there as well. But like I pulled in Chris Peterson, and then I think he started pulling people in, and I pulled in a few people from the Lightning Web Components architect team, the folks who actually built Lightning Web Components.
Oh, cool.
So I tried to like pull in like
Yeah.
product people so that they could actually see what people were really saying about the stuff that they were building.
Yeah.
So I'd
What
like to
real
think
real complaints were.
yeah, and you know, if I have a superpower, I'd say it's connecting people.
Hmm.
And I tried really hard to play that role because that particular community, people were just so frank and straightforward, and you know, plain speaking about what was working and what wasn't. And there's some incredible minds in that community that I still admire today. So
That's
yeah.
cool.
So how did I get started in technology though? That's
Yeah.
because you know, I didn't study tech. I wasn't a computer science uh, uh, major, as we say in the U.S. Um, I studied theater and I studied
Hmm.
French. But I had always worked with computers. My brother and I went to the same university, and my first day there, he like took me to the computer lab, set me up with an account on the VAX VMS mainframe that all the students use, and had email. And this was back in 1989, so I was using email back then, and I slowly kind of learned how to get my way around Vax, and
Hmm.
learned enough that I started to be one of the lab assistants, so I could do some basic system administration stuff on there. I was not a programmer by any stretch, but certainly used. I mean, you know, those days, like everything was a command line.
Yeah.
There were very few graphical user interfaces at that point. Um, in fact, I remember there was a huge deal when we got color monitors in the computer lab for the first time. It was just like, "Oh my god, this is amazing." And then, of course, all of the other stuff like Windows 3.1 came along, and eventually they had some Macs in there. Um, but then I went and I tried, you know, so I finished up university and didn't really know what I wanted to do. I think I kind of knew I was an okay actor, but not amazing. I wasn't really pulled by, even though I lived in California, I wasn't really pulled by trying to go down to Hollywood and make it.
Hmm.
Um, and so I did a 1 year volunteer program, which took me to Minneapolis. Was a full
Hmm.
time volunteer, lived in a community. It's called the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Learned just how badly I related to other people, and that kind of set me off on just personally trying to get better at like relating to people. Like something
Hmm.
about me was broken there as as a young adult. Um, and then work wise, I after my volunteer year, I stayed around and I just kind of like, you know, I'd gotten this advice from a performance artist in the Bay Area. So I went to school in San Francisco Bay Area.
Hmm.
Um, and this person, because I was like, what do I do? I'm about to graduate with a theater degree. What do I do?
Yeah.
And this person just said, like, do everything.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, like I'm gonna go do that. So I did the volunteer program, and after that, I started working for the charity, which is Catholic Charities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. I started working there full time, and then doing dance on the side, and then I got a full-time job in children's theater, and kind of all this time I sort of dabbled in uh, you know, working with computers. Again, not programming, but working with them. And in one of the summers between doing children's theater, uh, I was temping and I got a job, and uh, this was for the point of sales systems for a franchise that was based out of Minneapolis.
Hmm.
Uh, and I was kind of doing some, mostly paperwork. And then I started doing full time like customer service, and I moved into customer support as I just learned more about this pretty janky DOS based, like all manually put together. Like we had to take like raw hardware from Compaq and install like, modems and network cards, and, manually configure a Lantastic network. Uh, and I kind of moved into there and started learning a little bit about programming. I kind of got mentored by um, the lead developer of that system. Uh, and then I moved back to California, and kind of in there, just on that personal growth journey, I decided that trying to work full time and then trying to do theater in the evening was just kind of killing me. So
Yeah.
I just sort of focused, let me just do work for a while. I'm kind of enjoying what I'm doing. It's okay, and get my shit together, sort of emotionally. Um, and so, like, customer support, I started learning. Actually, the first program I wrote, I would say, was using Visual Basic for apps, so VBA.
Oh, yep. That's how
And
a lot of people get started.
yeah, I mean, really, Microsoft in the 1990s and early 2000s was, you could say that, like, especially Microsoft Access, it's the same, like, structure of what we do with programming in Salesforce, where there's a certain amount of stuff that you just basically point and click your way around, and then you augment that with the code that you need, but only the code that you need, right?
Yeah.
It's the same thing that Salesforce did.
No, it's
And I mean, that's actually like every job that I've had has been along those lines with some kind of technology like that, where there was some amount of configuration that, did genuine customization of what I was working with. But then there was a wall that you would hit that you could do with that. And then you'd have to break out to code and do something with that. And anyway, kind of getting ahead a little bit, but I, uh, moved back to California. I was kind of ready to be
yeah.
closer to my family, and I just missed California. I love California. Even though I live here, I still miss it. Watching the wildfires, actually, one of the Eaton Canyon fire, that if you've like watched what's
Yeah.
going on in LA this past week, that came within a mile of my childhood home.
Oh wow.
It actually burned down a church across the street from one of the schools I went to as a kid. So, like, it's just ripped through, like,
Yeah.
my childhood,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways. But, so that's been a interesting, anyway, so yeah, like, I'll always be a Californian no matter where I live in the world is kinda how I feel. And so I moved back to California, moved back to the Bay Area, got another job in tech support, uh, was promptly laid off, but um, fortunately, I was released from my, I was they had paid for my relocation, so I was released from the clause that I'd have to pay them back if I left work, and
Yeah.
I got into working with a Silicon Valley startup during the dot-com era that was enterprise software,
Hmm.
where there was some configuration and some code.
Yep.
That was called Octane Software, which was bought by Epiphany CRM, and that's kind of how I got into the CRM world. Did tech support for a bit. Was watching the training team where they were actually teaching people how to use, how to do the customization, how to use the APIs, how to write the code, and I got really interested in that. And at the time, I mean, Silicon Valley was crazy, and I mean, if you had a heartbeat and you could say the word computer, companies would hire you to go work for them to do crazy things. And then they would just, like, they figured you'd either learn on the job and you'd be fine, or you wouldn't, and they'd just letting you go, right?
Yeah.
So like they were just hoovering up anybody and everybody who had some kind of experience or who they felt that could work for them. And that kind of became my career for the next 12 years. I worked for Epiphany, worked for Computer Associates and their Wiley Technology Application Performance Management
Mhm.
division. And everything I was doing was around teaching developers how to use the software that these companies created. Um, Used my experience with Epiphany to get moved out to the UK,
Mhm.
and like that was in 2008
Oh,
in the
perfect
spring.
time. Like
Perfect
the
timing.
UK was
Mhm.
the UK was wonderful. As a fun side story, that was when I graduated,
Okay.
and I also don't have a computer science background. My background is maths, and I was going for investment banking interviews because I wanted to make a ton of money. Guess how well that was going in 2008.
Wow, yeah, that's bad timing.
I mean, it worked out in the end, man. I'm sat here talking to you. I mean, we wouldn't be doing that.
Yeah.
There's a parallel universe where, like, you're a Hollywood superstar, and I'm on a yacht somewhere having made millions as an investment banker, but it's not this one. So
So I would just say like, I I I know exactly the kind of actor that I would have wanted to be. There's a
okay,
guy called Kurtwood Smith. We
yes,
I think we were
we
talking
discussed him the
about
other
him.
day, didn't we?
Yeah. And, like, so Kurtwood Smith, anybody watching this, just go look him up. You'll have seen him, but you don't know who he is because he's just done these little parts, or in some cases, like, bigger supporting parts. But he's the kind of person who's had, he probably has, like, a really healthy income, he has tons of experience, he's worked constantly his whole life. But, he could still walk into a coffee shop and sit down and have breakfast and not be hounded by everybody. Like, to me, like, that would be the perfect Hollywood career. But you don't really get to control that, do you? You know?
He was he's for those who some people may be familiar with him from that '70s show, which is where I know him from
Yep.
best. But he is
RoboCop,
yeah, he's in RoboCop. He was in
tons of Star Trek.
Robot Chicken. He was in like Medium. He's been in loads of things,
Yeah.
and he plays the. I don't want to typecast him, but he plays the stern man in the background very well. Like that, like he turns up and just has like. I'm sure he's a lovely bloke. Like, and I'd
Yeah.
love to, Kurtwood, if you're listening, come on.
Come on the podcast.
But I'm pretty sure, like, he just has this kind of resting face that just looks like he's gonna like be annoyed with you.
Yeah. And the only reason I know him is because his daughter went to my university. So, yeah. I mean, it's,
Ah, cool.
yeah.
But but that makes sense. I mean, yeah, you're not looking for sort of super fame and fortune. Just yeah, he'll be a multi-millionaire and not having to work. But as you say, like it's that sort of thing where you'll look at him and go,
Yeah.
I know him, but where
Yeah.
from? Yeah, cool.
Yeah, so just to, I mean, to wrap up the whole like, Peter Chittum backstory. I have to cough for a moment
It's
here.
okay. The Peter Chittum origin story, as we'll refer to it.
Yeah, uh so once I got here to the UK, I managed to not get laid off from the job I got hired in, but the boss I was working for left, and the company was very clearly not investing in
Hmm.
that Epiphany product anymore. It had been bought, twice. There'd been two acquisitions since I had left, and so I just started looking around, and you know, for kind of anybody who would hire me, and had a few interviews. They went really well. weren't able to sort out my visa, and finally, Salesforce came along, and they started interviewing me before they had a head count. Is what I understood at the time. Uh, which, like, having been a hiring manager at Salesforce, I would never imagine doing that
Yeah.
I would have no faith that I would necessarily get that head count, and I would hate to really disappoint somebody. But it did make it really efficient, and they sorted out my visa, they got it switched over. And as an immigrant to the UK, I have to say Salesforce, their support for, people, living and working abroad in other countries besides, their home country was like absolutely amazing. There's a whole office that managed that,
Oh,
um,
cool.
yeah, like the support they gave for me and my family, and, was fantastic over the years. So did the instructor thing for a couple more years, like I said, and then I was ready to, I had 2 kids, my wife was getting ready to go back to work. I knew that, because instructor work, you have a 5-day week
Hmm.
where, you need to be very much connected, high touch to your class for that entire 5-day period. If you're going to travel and do it, you leave on a Sunday, you get back on a Friday. If you stack a few of those weeks together, you're barely home a day and a half each week. Um, it just wasn't going to work like family wise. And so I started looking around for other things. I looked several things in customer success. I looked at the SE route. And then I saw on internal chatter, Pat Patterson was posting about something, and I looked at his job title. It said developer evangelist, and I was like, "What is that?" And so I asked him and talked to him. He kind of gave me an informational interview. Interviewed with Dave Carroll. I actually, I, I didn't have as the interview process going from instructor to developer evangelist was the most intensive I've ever had in my life. I
Interesting.
interviewed with one, two, three, four, five, six different people wanted to
Oh, wow.
interview me, because it was a new role in EMEA for Salesforce, and so like there were all the stakeholders in the US who were interested in making sure that I was the right person for the job. And then there was all the stakeholders here. So the head of platform sales, for example, like he wanted to interview me. The head of ISV sales, Melissa DiDonato, she wanted to interview me, which that was like one of my favorite interviews ever. Because, and I'm not so sure she wanted to interview me so much as my future boss wanted to make sure that she had interviewed me, because we
Yeah,
got
yeah.
on, and she was just like, "So what am I supposed to do here?" And I was like, I don't
Hey.
know, like, it's like it was, it was something to the effect of, so do you think, I should like recommend the hiring? I was like, well, you need to make up your own mind about this. And I think
Yes.
like that was like good for her. She's very New York. And so
Yeah,
just sort of like throwing it back at her and saying like, it's not my job to tell you what to do. Like, make up your own mind, I think was like the perfect response for her.
yeah.
But yeah, so that's how I got here. And the other thing I'll say that was pivotal to kind of how I got into and got really interested in developer evangelism was my first 4 months at Salesforce was on the lead up to Dreamforce 2010. And
Hmm.
the whole training and certification team, which is what it was called then before it became Trailhead Academy, had a massive presence. Everybody in the world went to Dreamforce who was in training and certification. And I was just learning, right?
Hmm.
So I think I taught my first Salesforce training. I think it was after Dreamforce happened. Yeah, I think it was right around that time, because I was on that learning curve of I need to go from what I knew, which was
Yeah.
a Java based CRM that had some configuration in code, to you know this thing called Salesforce, which had configuration in code. And so on the lead up to Dreamforce, that was the first year that they had Chatter as the way for people to connect both before, during, and after the conference. And that was like when I first became familiar with Gary Palmatier and the awesome I forget the name of the chatter group, but like everything was awesome. Uh,
Yeah.
there was so much conversation going on, and I met people who I'm still friends with today, like Amber Boaz, for example, Patrick Connolly. There are folks that I bump into that, uh, you know, that very first instance of chatter during Dreamforce, I got to be a part of that, and I got to spend a lot of time on it because it was like, I'm learning stuff, and then I'd go and check out what was going on chatter for Dreamforce. That was fantastic.
That's
So,
cool.
and that really taught me about, I'd already kind of I'd already bought into Salesforce as a technology because I read the multi-tenant white paper my first week. I was blown away. I'd used it my first week because I went to the Dev 401 training I was going to be teaching, and the software I was using before that, Epiphany CRM. Yes, there was point and click configuration of that, but to
Mhm.
be honest, you had to understand the actual metadata model
Yeah.
in order to do it successfully. There was very little, input checking that you were doing things correctly. You had to manually run a metadata consistency checker after you had built it and make sure it didn't blow up. Uh, you know, and so it was actually harder to do the point and click stuff than it was to just go and write some Java code to make something
Oh,
do something. Um, so when I tried Salesforce and I was like, doot, 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 I just made a custom object, It's
yeah.
sort of like Neo after his first like kung fu match or what, kung fu like download
Yeah.
with the operator. It's like, I know kung fu, show me, So it's like I was really blown away, and it was like, okay, like, I've been working with this kind of stuff for years. Salesforce got it right. They absolutely got it right. And, in being a part of Epiphany, you would watch and sometimes participate in these projects that would be 2 years to go from nothing to production. So, you know, Salesforce got a lot of stick for the no software thing, eventually, you know, especially once they started getting into like, actually, you are going to write some software, which was absolutely
Yeah.
true. But the fact that there was an upgrade path for your custom code, for example, like that alone, I think
Mm.
was, to me, blew me away and showed me like you can do this in a way that your existing investment isn't just a sunk cost when you want to upgrade. The
Yeah.
fact that Salesforce would 3 times a year upgrade their functionality and not break things mostly. Uh, yeah, well, and yeah, I just have to say that because, like,
Oh, yeah.
stuff breaks sometimes. It just is like it's software, but
Oh, yeah.
the whereas with with Epiphany, nothing against them. That was the state of the art at the time, but the way that enterprise software worked was like that. Like, if you wrote custom code and then you upgraded to the next version, chances are you're going to have to rewrite all of that code.
Yeah.
You were lucky to get a new version once a year. 18 months to 2 years was between major releases for
And then you'd
most of
have to
the time
pay
I
for
was
the
there.
upgrade as well on top of it. Like,
And you'd have to pay for the upgrade, and so it's not like it's yeah, it did change, the amount of investment, especially for the larger, more,
yeah.
strategic customers that were running large parts of their business on Salesforce. Of course, a lot of that changed when there was a lot more software, to be written, a lot
Mm.
more Apex and integration and custom user interface and all of that. And so I get why they got the pushback eventually on the no software, but you know, the point of that was that actually, like, there's no software for you to install. Like
Yeah.
that was the thing, right?
There's no CD somewhere.
There's no CD. There's no go and get, blank canvas or blank, physical or virtual machine, stand up all of your stuff in your own data center, all of that stuff. Like that was really the no software message. It wore out, it had to be retired. I totally understand why, but I'm a little bit more forgiving of it than some people were,
Yeah.
especially towards the end of that particular marketing arc, can we say, of Salesforce.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think so there's that so thank you. That's a comprehensive backstory and
Yeah.
no, no, that really, really useful because I think there's a couple of things that so one of the things I wanted to say was you mentioned about excuse me, having Salesforce people in channels hearing and discussing things. As a shout out, I want to there's a one of the PMs called Jeff Kranz, who is a PM for invocable actions on Flow. He's in the SFXD
Okay. Okay.
space, and he's really good at engaging in there. And it's like I asked a question the other week about like, hey, I'm trying to do this for my product, and he was like, no, like yeah, we'd like to do that, but like you can't at the moment. I'd recommend doing a different way. And it was just really helpful to kind of get that feedback from someone openly and honestly, rather than it
Yeah.
be like, well, like try and reach out to support and get pushed back there and get told you need to pay for developer support or whatever it might be. So
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of that.
I've not managed to get really involved in SFXD. Also, Ohana Slack, I tried to kind of get engaged there, but I just
Yeah.
haven't gotten the traction. Probably, it's like you only have so much time for so many
Oh yeah.
um,
So many
online
channels.
communities, I guess.
Yeah, it's hard keeping up with all with so many.
Yeah.
Um, so the so a couple of things you hit upon there as well that I think are interesting is I don't think we've had anyone on the podcast yet, and this is probably just because of the selectivity of the data. But we've not had anyone on yet who has said, I studied computer science and wanted to become a Salesforce person.
No.
Everyone's just kind of like fallen into it. But I think that is just because the bias of the data is that, 10 years ago, nobody, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, nobody was like, hey, Joe, what I want to do is sales. Like when I started doing Salesforce, I did it because I was looking for a .NET job, and Financial Force was saying, "Oh, we're hiring .NET developers," when really it was, to retrain them in Apex and do Salesforce.
Yeah.
And
But
interestingly,
there's also the timing thing of they're just like, in order for someone to go through university wanting to, there needs to be enough visibility of that
yeah,
technology. And I mean, enterprise software just isn't sexy. Like it isn't. It's
whoa, hot take there from
I
Pete.
mean, it's
People don't grow up wanting to be an enterprise software developer.
people didn't even recognize Salesforce until maybe a couple of years ago, you
Yeah,
know? I mean, and what would have been the culturally significant signpost that would have told somebody who wasn't themselves in enterprise software or wasn't themselves a user of enterprise software, that would say that Salesforce actually existed until they started sponsoring Formula One a few years ago. There wasn't anything, right?
I uh, I have friends, and that's not the surprising statement here. I promise. So
You have
I have
friends?
some. Yeah, I know, shocking. But I have friends and family who like only know Salesforce or only have heard of Salesforce because of myself and as you know, Pete, Amanda, my wife, also works in the
Yeah.
Salesforce space now. I say now she's been doing it like 10, 11 years now, but relatively to me, I'm always like, she's only just started because because time dilates in funny ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes, a super experienced solution architect. I'm like, yeah, you're still fairly new at it though, right? Yeah, it's just. Um, but no, she's very very successful at doing it. But one of the things is that because we both do Salesforce,
Mhm.
we have friends and family who understand that Salesforce is a thing, and
Yeah.
occasionally will find themselves in spots like my brother's company got Salesforce, weirdly enough implemented by my wife's former company. She wasn't involved. It was just this kind of very strange kind of crossover.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but there was an advert on. I have a group chat with a couple of my friends and my brother, and a lot of the chat is either video games or football,
Yeah.
um, and soccer for our American listeners. But we were all chatting during a game the other day, and in the halftime adverts, there was an advert for Salesforce for Agent Force, and it was one with
Mhm.
Matthew McConaughey and not Owen Wilson, Woody Harrelson,
Okay,
in
yeah.
for like, it was some Agent Force retail advert. And yeah, genuinely, like the group chat, bearing in mind we'd just been chatting about the football, it was like, hey, I've just seen the Salesforce advert. What is this? That yeah, they only know it because
Yeah.
of having heard me kind of mention it. And it's as you say, I don't think that there is that crossover into the public space. And I don't think
No.
if you go and talk to most students, they're still being taught Java or possibly now Python or JavaScript. And
Yeah, yeah. I
that
mean,
people, they're not going to learn Java might be a proprietary language. Let's see how the legal cases still on go around that. But um, in general, they're not going to learn a proprietary language where it's not easy for you to get set up for free in a way that like a university can control.
yeah, certainly it wouldn't form part of a course of study. In in working in developer relations, I did from time to time go out to public university or to like schools and
Mm,
universities, and I would do like a you know hour to 2 hour long stand up your first create your first custom object and create a trigger for that object sort of thing for their computer science
mm,
um, you know, uh, for their computer science department. So it'd be sort of it wouldn't be necessarily like a formal part of the course, but it would be more sort of a here's an example of technology in the wild. We're going to have a guest speaker in. We'll learn something about this and do a bit of exposure to that. Uh, how many of those people would go on and actually do something with Salesforce? I would say, it's always going to be a very small number, but inevitably you would get someone who would come up and go like, this is actually really cool, like,
yeah,
and it is, the idea that you can essentially create a new place to store data in such a simple way as creating a custom object, as opposed to a more manual process
yeah,
of you know setting up a table in a database, setting up the data persistence layer, or tier or connector, and then writing some code and then surfacing that to the user interface. I mean, yes, there are web frameworks that help you do that or that shortcut that, but nothing I would say touches how quick and easy it is to
no,
do it with something like Salesforce. And presumably there are other, I've not explored, but in the back of my mind, I do think about things like ServiceNow and Zendesk and HubSpot, and I would assume that there's some corollary feature with
yeah.
those that kind of makes it easy for you to store some custom data somehow, related to your particular way that you're using that software.
Yeah, Monday is the one I get adverts for every 5 minutes on YouTube. So
Yeah, I see a lot of
there'll
Monday
be an advert for
advertisements.
Monday.com now that comes on the start of this Salesforce podcast. Yeah, it's um, so yeah, no, yeah, it's good to hear that you were out making enterprise software sexy for the youth. You know, that's the
Doing my
tagline for
part,
this tagline for
doing the
this
good work.
podcast now: making enterprise software sexy for the youth of tomorrow. Um, but so so obviously when you when you first started out and you were doing as an instructor, you you had to learn Apex and Visual Force in order to teach it.
Yeah.
I always think that a great way of having to ensure you know something is by trying to explain it to other people,
Hmm.
because you will get found out very quickly. Who you mentioned you went on a Dev 401 course that someone else gave. Yeah, so when so those who aren't aware, the what's now Trailhead Academy, when they still run in person courses and some virtual ones,
Yeah,
and
they call them instructor-led training or ILT.
that's it. Yes, and so I previously did them for Salesforce for a couple of years. Peter's done them for far more and for far longer. But before you could become a trainer, you have to go through and effectively undertake the course
Yeah.
and then also deliver it, which is not an insignificant amount of time and investment. It's a week long course, 3.5, 4 day long course for you to take, followed then by you then having to kind of, spend another 3 or 4 days potentially going through and teaching it. Um, Weirdly, I didn't have to do the I didn't have to do the full of either because
Hmm.
when I signed up to do it, like I was just as I was publishing book number 1, and they were just like, yeah, you probably kind of are okay with what you've done on Apex by this point. But
Right.
do you remember who taught you?
I
Uh,
do, yeah. His
who
name's
was it?
Harm Korten.
Okay.
Yeah, he's a Dutch guy, and he was a technical consultant, worked for a Dutch SI. Can't remember the name of it, but they were absorbed into some bigger SI, I think, between then and now. I don't know if he's still around the ecosystem. So that was for Dev 401. For Dev 501, I took it from a guy named Marco Custer,
Mhm.
who he's actually he leads. I think he's senior director for ISV technical evangelism here in EMEA. Uh, and he he left about a year. He left the training team about a year after I started,
Mhm.
year and a half to go and do the ISV technical evangelism job. That was another one that I looked at a little bit, but I kind of have um, I have a bit of a contrary streak to me. And the last two people who had been in technical instructors who had left the team had gone on to do ISV technical evangelism. And so part of me was like, I
No.
just don't want to do that because I don't want to be like a joiner in that way kind of thing.
See,
Like
I
there was
mean,
no rational thought to it. It was just more like, no, don't want to do that. I want to be different.
yeah, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. So with the with the evangelism role, then,
Mhm.
I have to say that one of the things that so when I started off, I'm going to say professionally working doing development. So I'm going to say professionally working doing development full time, to probably caveat that, because so when I was before I went away to university and things, as I've mentioned to people before, like I was programming credit card systems for the Daily Telegraph, using VBA and it was SQL Server, not Access, but same thing with a Access front end.
Yeah.
And VBA is one of the most amazing little things that's been invented. It's really quite clever.
Yeah. Oh
I,
yeah, very much so.
yeah, my first programming job doing that was the one that I learned the importance of naming things properly, because I kind of wrote all this code, and one of the chaps I was working with, who I think was the CTO of at Cloud Galacticos when I was working there, Neil. He reviewed it. He was like, "Well, does it work?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Well, I can't understand it because I named like variables were X and the function was called Y, and
Nice.
it was just kind of like wasn't human readable because I was just writing it for me to kind of get it done."
Paul,
Um,
this is not assembler. You can name things real things. So
and well, this is it, because like previous to that, I'd been like doing a lot of stuff on my. It was stuff that was going to be run in a different way, whereas beforehand I've been writing it on like my crappy 166 megahertz like home computer, and it
all
was
right.
like I just needed to condense things. But okay, as a really interesting aside, then sorry, this is off topic now. I was reading. I was I'm reading a book that's about to be published, and one of the things we were talking about was like naming variables in it,
Mhm.
and so in the book it talks about and yeah, I don't mind sharing this Pablo Gonzalez's upcoming book. It's going to be very good. It's all about clean code, and he talks about naming variables.
Pablo has
And
an upcoming book?
Pablo does have an upcoming book, yes.
I'm joking, like, he's been all over a bit, like, social
Yeah.
about it, so, yeah. Yeah.
And
That's
fair
cool.
play
I'm
to
looking forward to seeing that too, so, yeah.
yeah, it's and like I've read a bunch of it so far. It is really, I think there's a lot of developers that are going to learn a lot from it. Like, yeah, it's
Yeah.
not, it's a different kind of book. But excuse me, what I was going to say was, in that he talks about naming of variables, and quite correctly, I want to point out here, says that variable names in Apex shouldn't have anything to do with a type in them. So you shouldn't come up with you shouldn't call a variable like first name string. It should just
Mhm.
be first name, because it's a string
Uh-huh.
because of the declaration at the front. And when I read this first of all, I was like, I agree with you, but I also, and we didn't discuss this because this is pointless feedback, so I didn't share it with him. But
Right.
um, but excuse me. But one of the things that I remember and have worked with is what I'm going to call duck typed languages, which is the correct term. But like duck type languages, like um, like Ruby and like Visual Basic for applications, where in Visual Basic and VBA, you define a variable using the dim
Right.
keyword or the
Yep.
var
Mhm.
keyword.
Yeah.
Um, and you have no idea what that's good at. Like, it's just an open bit of memory that you're shoving something in. It's a bit like you can do,
Right.
it's a bit like you do in JavaScript, except JavaScript doesn't really follow this pattern. So, and JavaScript is a hellscape in many areas for language patterns and paradigms. So let's just ignore it for a second and let it go cry in the corner. But I was taught to kind of prefix the name of a variable with like str for a string,
Oh, yeah.
str
Okay.
first name, and it was one of those things. I was just wondering, as another kind of VBA stalwart, do you remember having to do that? And am I the only one who's kind of hallucinated that, or is that
Kind of. I mean, honestly, so the last time I did anything VB related would have been like 2002,
oh yeah,
2003. And that was actually VB script,
hmm
believe it or not. The external facing portal of that Epiphany CRM was it was basically a mishmash of ASP pages that were a mix of JScript and VB script, which like I
nice,
don't know how they came up with that, but like, clearly it was like, come on, make up your mind, right?
yeah,
And that was even like before the browser wars were really like uh finalized, I guess,
yeah,
because there was still this thing where it's like, no, actually this is our this is going to run on Internet Explorer, so we're using JScript and VB script because that works there. And it sounds like great.
yeah,
Um Anyway, so I kind of remember that. But at the same time, like I still use Python. I mean, Python has an option to specify typing, but a lot of Python doesn't. And I rarely use that, I'll be honest. Same thing with JavaScript. Like I don't think of
mm,
doing that. Um, unless I would say I have, sort of two representations of the same data in two different types at the same
yeah,
time. And so, like, I could see having, for instance, like, maybe a variable called current date. And then, if I need a string format of that current date str, just so that I
yeah,
know like which one's which, in case I'm, carrying both of those around at the same time. Just as it's the best example I can come up with, without planning ahead. I'm sure there's much better ones that you can think of, but yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think that makes sense. But I also, like and I think like you, I take a very non-dogmatic
yeah,
approach to things where, I think, you know, you should never do this it's there's a few things like that, but around things like syntax and naming convention and that
yeah,
sort of thing, it's sort of like, I think, I prefer to think of things as in all things of my life, to be honest. Instead of like you should never do that, it's like, well, what are the costs and what are the benefits of doing that? Because I think that's just a much better way of reasoning about whether or not it's worth like thinking about doing something. I think that goes for like if I
mm,
take an approach for programming, and it helps me think through like why I'm doing something as well. Like, yeah, I could not, I couldn't not use the str in the name in that particular instance where I have these two date representations in two different formats. But like, how am I going to come back and look at this and rationalize and reason about like what these two things are and why I might have done that? Maybe in that instance it does make sense, right? So yeah. So I tend to steer clear of pat universal pronouncements about
yeah.
things for that reason.
That makes sense. And I let's be clear. In Apex, I just don't do it because I've got the type in front. But like,
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
very similar in like, it's what works for you.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was just one of those funny things where you mentioned VBA. It just popped back in my head. It was like, one
Uh,
minute, I had this entire like thought process about it, where it was like, and I'm sure I had like an old JavaScript book and like ActionScript, it was recommended as well. And one of the Cold Fusion
Oh,
programming
Cold
languages.
Fusion. I never
Yeah,
used
that's
ActionScript or Cold Fusion, so
ActionScript was amazing. I bloody loved that language. And then Flash went and died on its backside. But just as a real other interesting aside, I have noticed, and this is anecdotal, Paul's anecdotal kind of thing, but I have noticed that in flows, you can
mhm.
tell whether someone how you can tell someone's level of previous experience with other computer systems by looking at flows.
Oh,
And this is again purely anecdotal, so I'm looking forward to the huge amount of comments and flame I'll get for this. But I have noticed that people who have either been trained by or are more experienced is the word I will use. I'm not going to say more mature, but more experienced and probably more mature people using Flow who have previously done stuff with Visual Basic for applications or Access or other systems tend to name the variables in Flow var something here, or will possibly do the prefix thing with str.
okay.
And they might even use f underscore for formula and things like that to name it to make it
Oh,
easier for them to
interesting.
see and know. Whereas those who haven't been either used other systems like that or been taught by someone who does that don't do that. And
Right,
it's
and that to me, that kinda makes sense too, because you sort of aren't you like, if you have, like, an input parameter on your flow, for example, like, you don't really see that anywhere represented. It's kind of off in a configuration panel somewhere, and
yeah,
so the only time you're gonna use that is when you're gonna assign it to something, and you just have that name to work with, but to know what exactly it is. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to
yeah.
me.
Yeah, no, it was just one of those really interesting things I saw. Like, it was when I was I was in a client org a while ago, but was managing people, and I noticed that there were these. I had two people building flows in this one org, and
Mhm.
one person was like, slightly more mature, had worked with a lot of other systems, and was doing this, and then the other newer person was not, and I was like, why? What's the difference here? And then like I've started spotting it like in more places. So there you go.
Yeah.
Weird anecdotal. We should run a survey or something on LinkedIn to say, do you do this? And like 2-step survey. Would you do this? And if so, how many years have you worked with other systems before Salesforce extensively?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It
So yeah,
makes it makes total sense too that, like, people with that experience would sort of fall back to that.
exactly. Yeah. So let's go back to. So obviously you did the training, and you did successfully pass your training period and did some teaching.
Yeah.
You then so I think the majority of your career and what people will most likely recognize you for though is the evangelism
Yeah.
roles you took at Salesforce, and it's we were kind of I hinted to this earlier. We were chatting off air as to when we met, and it would have been through, I'm sure, the evangelism roles, because weirdly
Mhm.
enough, you and I both started doing Salesforce at around the same time,
Yeah.
because the Dreamforce where Chatter was kind of the big thing. Um, I was when again, interesting side. It was at Financial Force. We built an entire thing around Chatter to announce on the stage at Dreamforce, and then it got pulled the night before
I
because
remember you
Salesforce like,
sharing about this.
yeah. So Salesforce was like, we're doing this as well. Like we worked on a thing called Chatterbox, and there's all this UI around it. It was going to be so you could chatter on records and on files and do all
Oh,
this stuff. And then yeah, Salesforce like really excited about it, like on the ISV team side, got us on the stage, and then someone just the night before was doing the run for them. Was like, that's our thing we were announcing. Like, why is the UI different? And it's kind of all that went down the drain. But
oh, man.
so you and I would have met at some point through the evangelism piece, and we've had
Yeah.
other evangelists on the podcast. So we've had people like Alba Rivas, who obviously used to manage and hired. We've
Yep.
had Rob Cowell, who's at
Yep.
Gearset, who I know you've worked with at Gearset, and you also he in fact shared that you interviewed him and didn't hire him at Salesforce. He was
He says that to everybody.
yeah, no, he
So
was like, I won't. You can go back and listen to the episode to hear all the names he calls you. No, he.
yeah, that's
But
right. I mean, in
um,
fairness to him, like, he says it anecdotally that, you know, uh, I offered him some feedback at
Yeah.
the tail end of that experience that he took to heart, and I think used to kind of to build into a portfolio that got him noticed and then hired by Gearset. So, yeah,
Yeah. No,
I
he spoke through that process with us
yeah,
on the podcast. It was really interesting, and yeah, and it's one of the things I love about Rob, and kind of also that you've hit on earlier is you and him are both very similar in your openness to say I was bad at this thing, and here's the story of how I was bad at this thing and got better at it. Because and I think that's really important for people to hear because it's very easy when you look at someone after 15 years doing Salesforce and go, man, these guys, Pete's got it together. He knows what he's doing, and it's like, yes, but you haven't seen the 15 years of like,
no, yeah.
you know. And then, if you ever do think that either Peter or I have it together and know exactly what we're doing, please come and watch a live stream to have that bubble burst instantaneously.
Yeah, but to me, like that, it's a bit of a tangent, and I don't want to talk too much just about the things that we're doing together now. But that's I've gotten so much value from practicing not knowing, like
Mm,
publicly. It's true as as somebody who's representing a product. By the time you stand up in front of a stage or put the camera on to record, you know y- there needs to be something that your audience is going to find value in as far as what you're doing. And I haven't been good at necessarily considering this over time, but it more and more, and the longer the longer I do this work in public, which I've continued to do since leaving Salesforce, obviously. um, the more I think about how valuable other people's time is. And
mhm.
if you're going to give me your time and attention to talk about something for 10 minutes or 15 minutes or half an hour, or in the case of the live stream 2 hours, like I really want to make sure that it it gives you something in advance. In the case of the live stream, like the whole, it's a bit contrived that it's meant to be like we've set it up so that we're struggling through something and then you're watching that. But when you only have 15 minutes, you better deliver the goods.
Yeah.
And I I always did that, and there was one time I didn't, and I hugely hugely regretted it. You know in you know Not to make excuses, but to really sort of tell the story, that would have been Dreamforce. It was either TDX, Trailhead DX, or Dreamforce 2019. And I'd been doing a talk where it had been based off of some work that I initially did at the Manchester Developer Group meetup, where I went off and I was trying to just show like all the different things that you could do using the command line,
Mhm.
to try and come up with like, here are some practical everyday things. And yeah, it must have been the Dreamforce because I got very involved in making sure my team was being successful. And they had what did they call it then? Uh, it was the robotics display that Philippe Ozil had put together several
Like the
years.
IoT stuff.
Yeah, and uh, they were having he was having a huge problem getting one of the robots to behave, because of some. He actually, God, Philippe Ozil he's like totally one of my heroes out there. He downloaded the firmware for this robot, found the bug, recompiled it, and re-uploaded it. I mean, he spent like the entire night prepping for this. But then I was spending time also helping support them and like writing some of the content that they needed to have, and supporting one of the other members of the team. And I didn't prep my own talk.
Mm.
And, it didn't go terribly badly, but it wasn't what I wanted it to be. Um, and it showed in the reviews that I got, and and that moment in time, and I'd always, it always had come easy to me to just like I would put it together and it would always work, and then that one time it didn't, and it
Mm,
really changed my attitude and started, it kind of forced some introspection about how I value the time of my audience, and making sure that what I deliver to them is something that they're going to walk away from feeling like, they've benefited from, from giving me their attention
mm.
for that 15 or 20 or 30 minutes or whatever it is. Um, so I feel like I've sort of rambled off, but that seems like where
No,
you were going with that.
no,
But
no.
yeah.
That's really interesting because that's I've spoken about this on the podcast and I know on the live streams before, and I spoke about this with Alba because Alba Rivas, who is one of the evangelists in EMEA at the moment, she does some live streams on Twitch. I think she does more than other places. And I was saying to her, like the as a similar sort of thing, I did a talk at London Schooling a number of years ago on building a Heroku app, and my
Mhm,
basic thing was I'm going to live build a Heroku app here just to show you how easy it is because I'd been talking to people and asking them, what do people want to see? One of the difficulties, I don't know if you have this as much as I do, but like in coming up with talks for events, like I can rehash like a talk I've done 1,000 times, but
mhm.
that's really dull to me. Like I want to do things that are new and interesting and exciting, and we'll talk a little bit in a minute perhaps about like different content types and the kind of how that kind of might look in the future. Um, but I'd seen a recorded video of someone do a live demo, and I've mentioned, and I'm apologizing to those who have heard me bang on about this like talk many times, but it was a talk where someone live built what's called the Y Combinator in Ruby and
Okay.
just kept on refactoring it. And so, yeah,
Do you mean
it's
like the Hacker News thing? The
so
Hacker News feed?
the Y Combinator is a function.
Oh. Oh, okay. Yeah,
So
okay.
it's a function in functional programming, and effectively you can use it to build the Fibonacci sequence
Okay.
really well. And there's this brilliant. I will again link to it in the show notes, but it's this brilliant talk where the guy just starts off and he live codes it. He like does a bit and then refactors it, does a bit and
Yeah.
refactors, and gets to the goes, look what I've got. It's the Y Combinator, and and it was just when you're watching someone at like their peak, just nail it.
Yeah.
And I thought like I want to try and do more, excuse me, more live things. But like I got to the end and we had a server running on Heroku.
Uh-huh.
It was not what I anticipated or wanted it to be. It did not. It was just not at the level I wanted to be. And I
Yeah.
was writing it and I thought like it's 30 lines of code. I've written these 30 lines of code like 30 times. I know what I'm doing. But I just stumbled on bits and like
Yeah.
when you're not as prepared as you should be. I should have been
Right,
able to
right.
like kind of I mean, what I really should have done is had a second screen, if I'm honest, with the code on there just to kind of nudge me along if I needed it.
Mhm.
Or some, or like I've learned since, have a second screen, have it in slides with your steps on it, or do something like that. But
Right.
I didn't, and I came out of that feeling like it had been terrible. I spoke to people who were there in it, and the one person who I'll give a good example of it, who was in there was Anup. Anup
Mhm.
Yadav, who
Yeah.
works at Salesforce now, but like used to run the London developer group, very experienced developer and architect, and a good friend, and someone who I trust to be honest with me in the same way that if you were in that audience, Pete, and in fact, you were in the audience at my London School and Talk this year, and I said, was that good? And I, know that you'll be honest to say good, bad, indifferent, change this, do this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And he was like, oh no, it was all right. He gave like decent feedback on it. He said tighten up these bits to do that. But that really stuck with me how perhaps as well, and you've got to be mindful of what you're delivering, as you say, but it's also going to feel worse when you're sat there in the hot seat as well. I think, and
Yeah.
that's a, and I'm not taking away from the point I think it's a combination of things of a remembering to really hit the level you're on about, and as you say, like make sure you're being aware of people's time, but
Mhm.
b for those listening as well. What I'd say is make sure you're prepared and do everything Pete was saying there about hitting the level, but also just be aware that like under the spotlight, it always feels worse. So if you think you stumble a little bit, no one else knows. Just laugh it off and keep on moving, and make sure that it keeps on. And like there is a really fine balance to I think be had of like making sure you hit the level of perfection you want as a speaker, but also like being aware that it's life and things are going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do agree that that's a really important, um, there's a, uh, there's a saying that I've heard that's, "Don't sweat the small stuff," and
Yeah.
it's all small stuff.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, at the same time, I think, I totally take to heart what you're saying, and I think especially if you are a new speaker
Yeah.
and you're learning what it means to stand up in front of an audience, to deliver something, you need to cut yourself some slack because the way people get good at doing things is by repeating them. And so the first time, the first 10 times maybe, it it may feel really awkward because you haven't really calibrated yourself for what good feels like.
Hmm.
I've calibrated myself. I mean,
Yeah.
I was in a boys choir and I was performing in front of audiences by the time I was 7 years old. I've never not been on a stage. Uh, and so I think, you know, I don't wanna discount what you say at
No. No.
all, but, I do think there comes a point where, at least for myself, you know, I got to understand what good feels like, and that's not to say that, like, I've lost a whole lot of sleep over this thing that happened at one conference and, you know,
Yeah.
everybody makes mistakes, like all of that stuff totally applies. At the same time, you know, I realized that in running up to that, and preparing it and having made the commitment to deliver something at a conference where people are paying a lot of money to attend,
Hmm.
um, you know, for a company that has very high standards for production values and for delivering something that is going to benefit their customers. um I didn't have my priorities right when I was prepping for that, and so I think those are like, you know you always have to consider the case, and
Yeah.
um you know like and then you go on and you learn, and I did, like, I really tried to, I've tried to take that more and more seriously, and when I'm getting better. It's taken, there 2019, that's like 6 years ago now,
Yeah.
well, at least 5 years. It's taken me, the ship turns slowly, right? But, I'm getting better at giving myself more prep time on the run up to these things. And, I'm never going to be the kind of person that dry runs something 100 times and I can do it in my sleep. And part of the reason for that is I prefer to be speaking from the knowledge and experience that I have than to a script where I've written down the knowledge and the experience, if that makes sense. I mean, to me, I feel like the best things I say come when I'm not scripted, but I just know what I want to say, or I know
Yeah.
what I want to communicate. Some people work with the script way better. Totally cool. Like, rock on with that. Like, know your way of presenting, know what works for you. I did this recently. So, one of the clients I have, I went on and I presented for it's my first time doing a a demo jam,
Okay.
and I wanted to do a recording of that same demo jam, that they could put and, use on their YouTube channel so that they could have the demo, sort of available and something that they could use. And I did it from a script the first time, and I went back and watched and I was like, "Oh, that's awful." And so, but I sort of wanted to do that so that I could have it really well programmed. And then I went back and I just, like, more improvised it. and it was so much better.
Yeah.
So, like, I can see it in my own, in what comes out of me and what I produce. So I'm just gonna check. My phone dinged, so put that on silent. Um, I can see, like, and it's great with video these days. It's so much easier to get a video of yourself than it was when I first started.
Oh yeah.
Um, when I first started, we'd get out a huge, like, video cam to record a training if we wanted to, like, go back and watch it back. Um, I've seen where and how I do my best work. And so knowing that that's the case, though, I need to make sure that there is that minimum level of preparation. Like, I can't just, like, completely improvise.
Mm.
And partly because, the nature of my work today isn't that I am day in and day out writing this code, in production for customers. Like, my job as a developer advocate, and developer evangelist, leading the team. My job before that, when I was an instructor, and my job today, like, I'm not the person who's out there writing code day in and day out, for, you know, 4 to 6 hours a day, so that I just automatically remember how to
Yeah.
do this thing. And so what that means is I need to make sure I give myself the prep time so that I can go and actually produce the story, that I want to, for somebody that's going to, help them be successful in whatever way I'm trying to help them.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioned there about your role nowadays doing developer evangelism, and obviously all the roles you've had doing a developer evangelist role. So as I mentioned, we've had Alba and we've had Rob both on here give their thoughts on it. So
Yeah.
for you, I think you're the most senior person we've definitely had on the podcast in terms of developer evangelism experience, both in length of time and managing a team, and kind of what I'm going to say is having the more strategic view
Hmm.
of developer evangelism and developer advocacy as a program. So could you tell us why? So first of all, what is a developer evangelist? Because I always love to get another person's like definition so that we can
Yeah.
effectively have a throwdown between you, Rob, and Alba at some point, and you can fight it out. But second, but not just what an evangelist or an advocate is, because I think that they're two different roles, and I'd be interested to understand where you think the difference is. But also, why is developer evangelism and developer advocacy important, and what type of companies is it important to? So I have run consultancies, I run an ISV. Um, is it important to me? Is it just important to big organizations like Salesforce with a platform? Who should care about developer evangelism and advocacy?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it kind of breaks open a huge can of worms that I've been very interested in over the last couple of years since I left Salesforce. Uh, and to zoom out even further, you know, the work of developer evangelism or developer advocacy, um, that fits under a broader umbrella that is referred to as developer relations.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of good work out there uh, describing what developer relations is. It's a relatively new part of the technology community, and it didn't really need to exist before the kind of revolution that happened that inverted the decision layers of technology acquisition, um, and software development. When I first started in enterprise software, everything was top down. If you wanted to go and do something with, like a enterprise class piece of software, it was exorbitant. The amount of money that you would need to pay to get the license to actually use that thing or to learn it. You could go and take a training for a few $1,000s, and then you might get sort of a license to use the training version of that. I did that actually with WebLogic Server at one point.
Yeah.
I went
What
to
is
a
it?
WebLogic Server training for a week, and I got a license to use WebLogic Server and their disks, their CDs to do that. But I think that training cost like $3,000 to do. Um, and so
So just
So
on that, I was going to say as well, it's also, sorry, just to add on the cost there that I think some people forget as well, is that when Peter is on about CDs with the server on, like you then needed to have a piece of hardware
that could run
to
that.
run that. Like
Yeah.
there was an entire, and I know the market still exists, but I remember in my first series of IT jobs looking at server specs
Hmm.
compared to the specs of them, like of what Microsoft said you needed to run the thing or whatever said you needed to run the thing, and it was like, well, how? And there was this entire market of tuning and understanding. Well, like if I have 100 users making 100 requests an hour each, I'm
Hmm.
going to need to have this kind of config versus this kind of config. If it's 10 users making 10,000 requests, and like there was a whole cottage industry almost just around tuning your hardware specifications on your server, which would, by the way, cost probably around £5,000 to £10,000 or dollars itself
Yeah.
minimum, and then you needed two of them because you need to have a backup somewhere, and you needed to have it wired into a physical network. So I just to kind of bring into people's minds when we're saying about this, like the cost of using anything was exorbitant, and that's why I think there was a massive pirate market at the time.
Well,
Part of the
yeah.
reason
Yeah.
I think that pirate markets have gone away is A, cost of lower, but B, no one has CDs to be able to pirate it anymore because you don't install it.
Yeah. And so the open source software movement came in and just blew that apart,
Mm.
and all of a sudden you started having, cloud computing as well. So like if you and when I say cloud computing, let's set Salesforce aside and talk about what the rest of the world calls cloud
Yeah,
native these days. Which is basically infrastructure, application servers, database servers, file storage, all of those services that you might need as a and I guess virtual machines too were a part of that early on, where all of a sudden you could sort of stand up the environment, get an open source, piece of software, and just go and write that code, and like nobody would charge you for like basically learning it.
yeah.
Um, and so that created a dynamic where companies now wanted to, they recognize the importance of software developers as, you know, at the very least, major influencers in the software acquisition process. And oftentimes, more and more software developers being the actual purchasers, and the decision makers in which software stack was going to be adopted to solve a particular problem.
Mm.
Now all of a sudden, you know, you have a population that is part of your distribution process as a software company that is highly marketing skeptic,
Yeah.
if not marketing allergic. And how do you appeal to them and get them interested in your technology that you want them to use? Well, you need to basically get other software developers to go and talk to them and show them, like, hey, I made this thing work. That's what developer relations is. It's essentially the the organization within any company that markets to, uh, enables, um, creates the documentation for, uh, and communicates with and builds community around their practitioners or their developers.
Do you
Um, yeah.
do you think it was one of the things that I'm always interested in? Just as and so that was really really helpful. Thank you. And one of the things that I'm always really interested in is I often hear from people that no one did this before Salesforce, and I can and like
Apple
it
were the
might just
first
be
ones.
say again.
Apple.
Well, this and so like what I was really interested in is can you give some examples that you've seen before you moved into the Salesforce space of people doing this really well kind of early? Because I know when I was in the .NET space, there's people like Scott
Yeah,
Hanselman
Scott
and
Hanselman's.
Scott Hanselman's the ultimate. I don't even think just .NET, just tech
Mhm,
guy that
mhm.
kind of is an evangelist. But yeah, could you? Are there examples you can give around that?
Well, I can't say that I knew them before because
Yeah.
I really cottoned on to what developer relations was when I was hired into it, which is the story of my entire technology career. It's like Peter goes and does something, looks around, sees what's interesting, goes and does it for a while, learns what he needs to about that, and then kind of like moves on to the next thing. Like whether
Yeah.
it's which technologies I've learned or what jobs I've pursued, like that's how I've done my thing. And so like I was really unaware of what developer relations was before I joined the developer relations team. And thankfully, John Stevenson was the other developer evangelist here in the EMEA region.
Mm.
And I learned a ton from him because he was so much a part of the London open source community. I mean, he was active all over the place. You would go into a conference and he would know like half the people there. So and he was a huge advocate for Heroku.
Mhm.
I think he struggled with like really getting on board with Salesforce. It just kind of wasn't his flavor of software, like, which is totally fine. Like some people, that just no matter what you do, you show them what Salesforce is, and they're like, whatever. Like,
Yeah.
I want to go do this open source thing over here, and like that's what they do, right? Um, so yeah, but so who are some of the big people? Well, I know a little bit of the history, and at least the lore is that the person who really broke open the idea of developer evangelism is Guy Kawasaki,
Mhm.
and he was kind of the first developer evangelist that anybody can think of who actually did that for Apple and Apple's developer community. Scott Hanselman's a great person, who like he continues to be a huge advocate for developers and developer focused technology and communication. He blows me away how productive and like how much he stays involved with and how kind of dialed he always is to what's going on with technology.
I think that Scott Hanselman is actually three people. There's a certain amount of me that cannot believe the amount he gets done.
Oh yeah,
And like,
yeah.
but it's one of those things that like I see him sort of producing all this amazing tech content and learning stuff. Like, how are you doing that? You can't have time for anything else. And he's like, he has a wife and children and a life, and
Mhm.
then he's like, oh, and I was playing this video game at the weekend. I'm like, what? How? When? Who? What? You? I can't even get a sentence out about how I don't understand. So I think Scott Hanselman is actually three people.
Yeah, 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 yeah. There's a couple of other people, and I you know, unless I'm thinking about something actively at the time, uh, yeah, maybe what I'll do is I'll like put up a list of like
Yeah, please
these
do.
are developer relations folks you should follow, um, you know, uh, and like let you share that in the show notes because I do
Yeah.
think that if somebody's interested in this, there are people that are sort of actively out there doing the work and doing it very publicly that like they're absolutely folks that you should follow. I mean, honestly, Alba does such a great job of it
Yeah.
herself. Um, Before Alba, we had some other folks on the team. I mean, the entire team who's still actively at it. So Moshe Srivastava is doing it. Philippe Ozil. Um, uh, Akshata Sawant, she's the sort of MuleSoft
Okay.
developer advocate who's here in the UK. Danielle Aragui, she's very data cloud focused. They're all doing a fantastic job in that team right now. Um, you know, and especially given the direction that Salesforce is going in right now and the amount of focus they have. They're very clearly, they've gotten the brief and they're out there, trying to show developers how to go be successful with Agentforce, which is, that's exactly what the job
What
of
it
a
is.
developer advocate is supposed to be, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But
Is
there's a
it?
few others that are more broad out there.
Yeah.
I'm not remembering names at the moment,
It's okay. We can.
but I'll put them out there in case people want to go and take a look at some of them. But they always have a pretty good profile and they're easy to find and follow.
Yeah. No, that sounds awesome. Thank you. That'll be good to see. I mean, you one of the things you said there about like there's a certain number of people that you show Salesforce to and are always going to like, meh, don't like that. I
Yeah.
want to go do this other thing. Um, Reminds me that when I switched from doing .NET to doing Salesforce, I went back to the company I was at
Hmm.
previously and showed them Salesforce because we were building this online cloud-based database to kind of manage all this stuff. And I'd spent literally like 3 weeks working on like a series of different login problems and login pages and
Yeah.
just kind of database management because we had to go through certain security requirements for one of the clients that it was like the UK's largest kind of supermarket chain,
Hmm.
like at the time, and excuse me, and it was mad. And so I came in and showed these guys, and I was like, "Look, this is Salesforce. Look how easy it is." And I showed them like setting up what I'd been working on with them, and in
Yeah.
like an afternoon, we got to very very basic kind of standard layout stuff. But like, look, here's all the database that you guys are working on that I've rebuilt it for. And I said to like sort of going through it, and they were really interested. And one of the guys, I said to one of the guys like, "Yo, so what do you think?" And he was the developer that had been hired to kind of replace me. And he was a bit more senior than I was. And he was just like, I'm never going to, no, we're not going to go with this. And I was like, okay, well, what's the reason why? He was like, he said, the entirety of this is to replace developers. And like, you don't need to write any code. And like, and he said, like, it's not for me. He said, like, I don't want to be doing that. And it was really interesting because every time I hear someone say about Agentforce replacing developers, I was like, I got told that Salesforce was replacing developers like 15 years ago. So, we'll see. But
There's a bit of open source and like versus proprietary bristling that can happen as well. At one point early on in my role as developer evangelist, I had found this um what it was called, something like Open Code Academy that was based out of Berlin, and
mm,
it just seemed like, oh, this is perfect. Like, they're trying to reach people who are reskilling and like helping them
yeah,
succeed. And I approached them and said, hey, could I do something here? Wouldn't charge anything. It's what I'm paid to do anyway.
yeah,
And the only reason that they came up with uh, that why I couldn't do it is because it was proprietary.
yeah. And it's
Um,
it's madness. Like you get
yeah,
some people, you get
and
some
again,
people like
that goes back to my like, I just don't believe in being dogmatic about these things. Like, use the technology that works. If it's open source, cool. If it's proprietary, that's cool too. Like, just use it. Like, you
oh yeah.
know,
One of the interesting things we're just chatting then that I thought about as well is I noticed just, and this is again probably just within the Salesforce space. I think that there was a huge take up of Macs in the Salesforce. Like when I first started doing Salesforce, everyone was still on Windows laptops, and I
mhm,
noticed this shift to using Macs more and more and more. To the point now where I think that like a large proportion of Salesforce consultancies, partners, everyone all use Macs. And part of the drive for that, I think, at one point was developers wanting to do more web stuff and
mm,
Apple just nailing, like, not even Apple nailing, let's be clear. Apple's like partners that were building like TextMate, Sublime Text,
mhm.
you know, um, really kind of nailing down the developer experience for writing JavaScript and CSS
Yeah, okay.
that and like and when and I think like the emergence of Git as like kind of the default option for like source control is just much easier on like a Unix based machine than it was on Windows, and all of
Right.
these things added up were
Yeah.
like and then sort of the things like Maven's Mate going out on TextMate and stuff like that I think made a massive amount of difference to really drive it, where as you say it's developers driving the technology choice rather than developers turning around to IT and being like, no, I want a Mac because it will work better and be easier
Yeah.
rather than
It is interesting though, because I mean, this goes back a few years, but there was one point in time where, I looked around and like everybody who was ever talking to developers, like the whole developer relations team was on Macs, and all of the product managers were on Macs. And, when we did some digging around, we found that actually if you asked our developer community what percentage of them were actually using Macs, it was the majority were using Windows, in fact.
yeah, interesting.
And I always felt like, are we doing the right thing here in that nobody's actually using Windows? And like most of our audience is actually using Windows, and it kind of drove me to toy with that a little bit. That same um, talk that I gave a few times, which was I think it was called "Solving Everyday Problems with the Salesforce CLI."
Yeah.
I initially did that on my Mac, and then I redid the talk so that I could actually do it all on Windows with PowerShell and everything that I
Right.
had
Yeah.
produced on my Mac, I reproduced and figured out how to do that on PowerShell, which was really interesting. Like,
Yeah. Just so
like
you had
how
the
you
ability to do it.
yeah, and like, how you do an alias on, in Bash is it's very, very straightforward, but like there's certain things you can do with an alias, but you can't really pass parameters in PowerShell. So you have to sort of write this PowerShell function. And then there's a whole thing around like who gets to actually execute a function when you download it and how to enable it. And like there's some honestly like PowerShell has some really good security so that like, to prevent the running of malicious code. Um uh anyway, so you know I wanted to be able to sort of represent what, the rank and file typical developer was
Mm.
doing. I think those of us who tend to so I think in the US, it might be the case that a lot more people are using Macs. I think probably also in a lot of parts of EMEA, especially the sort of more top tier geographies for Salesforce. And especially I think where people are actively engaged in the community, it seems like everybody else he sees people using Macs. And so most of the time they'll go off and they'll use a Mac as well. But I think when you get outside of that, my guess is today I would I would bet that the majority of Salesforce, of developers using Salesforce, are using Windows.
Okay. Interesting. Interesting. So
Mm.
one of the things that you one of the things I really want to talk to you about is when we were saying about you having that kind of strategic view as well. So is and kind of this ties into what you were saying just then with kind of bringing the content and the information to everyone in what they're doing.
Yeah.
Um, you were very involved in there's this small learning platform that Salesforce had called Trailhead. If anyone is listening to the podcast and does not know what Trailhead is, first of all, thank you for getting an hour and a half into this episode and apparently knowing nothing about Salesforce. But so
Yeah.
Trailhead, obviously, everyone knows, huge, big online learning platform. You were involved in helping write some of Trailhead because at one point it probably still is a Ruby app that was running in the background somewhere. Because I remember getting a bunch of Ruby errors more than once, where it was kind of going through and helping the team debug early versions of it.
I've
So
never heard
tell,
otherwise, but yeah, the entire Trailhead application is on Rails.
yeah, not just literally, but figuratively. But yeah, but so tell us a little bit about about working on that, about writing content for Trailhead, and
Well, it's funny. So everybody, people mostly associate, the and rightfully so, so like Trailhead was an idea that Josh Burke um, uh, came up with.
Mhm.
He called it Metals, and now he has said this, but I don't remember. I'll be honest. I have a vague recollection of us having a conversation because we were running around doing these Elevate workshops,
Mhm.
and so it'd be like a 1 day workshop. You'd go through and like we'd have three different tracks, and one was kind of the point and click track, and one was the code track, and then there'd be like a Heroku track or some other
Yeah,
track, depending on who the audience was, and what we wanted them to get from it. And after one of these, I think he and I were just talking, and I guess like we were brainstorming about the idea of wouldn't it be cool if you could have some kind of application that would test that, that you could give people, essentially exercises to do and then would test that they had completed them. And I was like, and I think, at the end of that conversation, my reaction was, cool conversation. And I went back to my life. But Josh was like, I got to get busy building this thing.
yeah.
And he did. And like, it was like a month or two later, he came and demoed it for the developer advocate or developer evangelist team meeting. He got interest. So Sandeep Banat he was a former developer evangelist, but he had kind of started doing these special projects. So like he was responsible for the mobile gallery, and he had done the Salesforce Wear,
Hmm.
where it was all wearable devices. And then he got his hands on this as kind of his next project. And in doing that, he basically stood up this very basic learning application with a few basic modules for Dreamforce 2014. I got kind of roped into it. Like, I didn't really know what was happening, but my boss contacted me and he was like, "You're helping with this. Start now."
Who was your boss at the time?
Guillaume Roch, he's
Oh yeah.
yeah, so he led the developer relations team in EMEA for when we started it up here. And, so he basically loaned me out to that team to help out. And my job was writing hands-on challenge code, which was basically handwritten Ruby scripts. Josh had written up a test harness where it was Josh, somebody had written up a test harness where once you wrote the script, you could invoke a little command line call. It would execute the Ruby script and tell you whether it actually ran successfully. This was
Mm,
how we built hands-on challenges.
yeah.
No IDE. I mean, it was just, and then it would be embedded inside of this JSON file that would have all of the metadata about, that particular badge, basically.
Wow.
Um, so that was it. Like that was kind of my initial thing. And I did that for 2 or 3 different modules. They were all of the declarative ones. So, so for instance, if early on you had gone through and done the formulas and workflows um, module, like the hands-on challenge you ran, that was my code that basically went into that hands-on challenge.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, Trailhead, it kind of was picking up steam over the first year, and so I would occasionally work with them. And then they kind of got materialized. Obviously the success took off. There was huge, interest in the community. That team was materialized into its own team within developer relations, and then eventually subsumed developer relations, where
Not just
Team
developer relations,
Trailhead
subsumed
basically.
everything.
Yeah, it really did. It was interesting to watch and be a part of that, where Trailhead, it became Team Trailhead. It almost became like this little startup within
Mm,
Salesforce. We all kind of got pulled along behind it in the wake. Um, and, eventually, Team Trailhead, and there were some things that happened. You could say it subsumed things, but there were some really good changes that brought about.
yeah.
Before Team Trailhead happened, there were 2 different MVP teams. There was one for the platform MVPs, and there was one for the Salesforce MVPs. And that got all pulled together into one thing. The whole community team got brought into Trailhead, and that kind of saw the merging of those platforms. Training and certification got pulled in as well, and that became Trailhead Academy. Although they'd called themselves Salesforce Academy for a while. And all of a sudden they weren't part of, they were no longer sort of part of customer success, but they were part of, they were, full-fledged part of Team Trailhead. Um, and it was really amazing to see all of that happen. And on the technology side, like so I had my early contributions, and then because Trailhead kind of became its own team, they now had all of the infrastructure. So they had hands-on challenge writers, and they had editors, but you could go and write a module. So I think the piece of Trailhead that's still around that I'm most proud of is there's a module there that's called um, I think it's called JavaScript Skills for Salesforce Developers. Um, that came about because we knew Lightning Web Components was coming.
Yeah.
We knew like for 2 years before that Lightning Web Components was coming, and as that that event horizon was approaching, how you wrote an Aura component, or how you write even today an Aura component, is weird JavaScript. It's just
Mhm.
strange. Um, and there were all kinds of problems with the actual compiler that they were using, because like there were certain features of ES6 that just weren't supported. And if you tried to use them, it would fall over. Um, so it was like you were almost sort of stuck in JavaScript of 5 years previously when you were writing Aura components.
Mm.
In moving to Lightning Web Components, we were going to absolutely current state of the art, pinned to, the current available features of Lightning Web Component, and um, polyfilling the bits that we knew were coming as part of the
Mm.
ECMAScript standard, but weren't available in browsers yet.
Yeah.
And so there was a need, like, you could see really clearly there was a need on the part of our developer audience to help them take on board how to use JavaScript. And so that's why I wrote that module, was basically like, here's a JavaScript primer. Whatever you've been doing with JavaScript, like, forget it. Like,
Yeah.
start over, because JavaScript on Visualforce was all kinds of janky, or you were using someone else's framework. JavaScript for Aura was just janky and weird and written by people who knew Java, and it looked like it and felt like it. So start over, learn from scratch. And I did this. I had to do this for myself. Like, I wanted to go and learn, like, what is state of the art JavaScript. I've been watching the progress of uh the whole progressive web
Yeah.
technologies as they were developing at the time. And god, it wasn't even called, it was like ES 2015, or yeah, I guess it was
Yeah. It
ES6,
was,
right? There was the
they
ECMAScript 5, and then there was ECMAScript 6, and then it became dates, right? And
yeah.
so, like, it was even named something different. But I had been seeing that there were, like, these really cool features that were being added to JavaScript from other languages, and things like dematerializing objects into variables. And, like, there were some really cool features that we just couldn't use in Aura. And so that was that was the mission I set for myself with that. Was, if you're a Salesforce developer, or even if your experience is in object oriented programming, and you think JavaScript is a toy and a joke, let's talk about, and a lot of my inspiration from that had come from what I had read from other people, following people like, Scott Hanselman. There's a guy called Christian Haleman,
Hmm.
who was also a Microsoft evangelist. There was another evangelist from Google, and I can't remember his name right now, who was producing some really great stuff. Uh, so I'd watch these people who were on the bleeding edge of JavaScript, showing what was possible. And so and then, of course, reading JavaScript: The Good Parts from Douglas Crockford. So, like, I had seen that there was, like, there's something real here, and whether or not you think it's real, it is a language of the web. So
Yeah. Oh,
let's
yeah.
let's
Everyone's
let's
using
all
it. So
learn
whether
the
you
right
like it or
way to
not,
use
get
this
on
thing.
board. Yeah.
Sorry?
So whether you like it or not, you got to get on board. Like, you
Yeah,
can have
totally.
all the opinions you want in the world, but if everyone else is using it, guess what you're going to be using?
Yeah, and it's, and it wasn't even just on the browser, because, like, Node had become kind of the de facto
Mm.
scripting language for a lot of system admin stuff, and Node based applications. And, like, I mean, Express for a while was just like, it was the de facto way to go and build an application server, was write a
Yeah.
Node.js Express app. So anyway, so that was my goal, was to bring that along. And if you uh if you run across it, like, to me, like, that's the little corner of Trailhead that I feel like I've had the biggest impact on, um you know just by virtue of being, uh you know the the writer
Yeah.
of that module. um there's certainly other things I helped with, but I mean, Trailhead, it at its height,
Yeah.
because I would say we're past that now.
Hmm.
I think it's fair to say, not that it isn't an important force in Salesforce, but I would say it's no longer the center of gravity that's moving
Mm.
Salesforce like it was, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Um, it was a huge organization, and and it will, I think it will always be an important part of Salesforce, and you don't get something like that without a lot of people being involved.
No.
I was a very bit part player. Apparently I was Josh Burke's muse for
So
for
basically, I
thinking of
mean,
it.
we want to call you the what we might call Josh the father of Trailhead then, but should we call you like the muse of Trailhead or like the
Maybe I could live with that, although I don't even need that. Like, I'm happy with like my one little module that makes a difference for people who want to learn JavaScript. There were so many people that were involved in making Trailhead successful over the years. To begin with, Sandeep Banat and Chris Duarte, who really spearheaded the whole thing. They pulled the team together. The early product management was done by Samantha Reddy and Adam Torman, and Adam really, really led the kind of charge on pulling the product together. Um, Douglas Bidding was the software architect, and honestly, the whole Trailhead team. Uh, Ruby isn't known for being particularly performant, and especially like the early version of Trailhead, I found to be very, very slow. But
mm,
they really did a great job on building a resilient, really useful, and eventually multi-tenant platform, because
yeah.
Trailhead now is multi-tenant with my Trailhead, where if you want to stand up your own Trailhead, you can do that. And like Douglas was the one who architected that and put that all together. um yeah, and like the whole editorial team, there was an internal conversation that, I think it's not going to be a huge thing to share a little bit about this, but so for every major release, there's a big get together where all the product people kind of come together and share about what their roadmap is going to be for the next few releases. And I remember this one where Sandeep stood up and presented like the priorities for Trailhead, and the leadership team there basically poked tons of holes. And in the midst of that conversation, the penny dropped that the value out of Trailhead was the voice.
Mm,
And so if the voice of Trailhead, because what makes it different than just any other learning platform? Well, it was quirky and a bit weird and fun. The hands-on challenges were really important, but you couldn't do that for everything, so you needed multiple choice. And if you're going to do that, then what makes it different from just like doing the same online training that everybody else is doing?
mm,
It was the editorial voice, and they recognize that. And that editorial team, is still there today and is really responsible for making sure that whoever writes a module, it still looks and feels like Trailhead. And that can be literally anybody, somebody who's in HR, somebody who is in a technology team or a product manager, someone who's in documentation. There are members of the community who've written Trailhead modules, and people who work for ISVs and SIs who've written Trailhead modules, and they all still feel like Trailhead. And that's because of the work that editorial team. And then you absolutely have to mention, like, one of the things that is 100% part of Trailhead is the design.
mm.
Um, uh, and that's Dominique Sillette Buxton. She is the one who, she was the designer, the lone designer on the developer relations team. Um, she's the one who designed. Actually, I think she may not have actually designed Astro. That may have been Amanda who worked for her at the time. But Dominique led that team and
Yeah.
kind of turned that feel that was that time of the world of Salesforce. Like that was that a lot of that had to do with Dominique and the work that she did.
Oh, awesome. No, and that's incredible. I mean, to hear, let's say, Trailhead definitely, I think, dominated Salesforce for
Yeah.
so long. But one of the things I suppose I'd like to then kind of lead on to and ask you a little bit about is obviously Trailhead was huge, and and we'll say for better or worse in some instances, like took the center of attention and was the focus in some of the areas. But I know whilst you were leading the evangelism team as well, one of the things you did was you helped get the YouTube channel like streamlined up, updated. There was the developer blog rework. There's a lot of stuff that was done. Um, excuse me, outside of Trailhead in using different mechanisms to kind of go out there supporting Josh when he was doing the podcast and all these things. So I suppose what I'd like to kind of finish up a little bit on is, from what you've seen around your time training and kind of pushing these different initiatives, where do you think the kind of future of content for developers is going? So is it podcasts? Is it video? And I'm not just asking this selfishly so I can go away and get ahead on Peter's vision, but you know, is it podcast? Is it video on YouTube? Is it shorts? Is it longer, deep?
Mhm.
There was a blog I wrote last year about where has all the deep technical content gone on Salesforce, which got a lot of traction because people were saying, where has it gone? And they were struggling to find it. And so yeah, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on, if you were looking today, or if you're thinking today about where the technical content is going for people, whether it's admins, developers, whatever.
Yeah.
Where do you think that future lies, and is it actually kind of across all these things, or just one?
Yeah. So before I do that, I want to make really clear, so I would say, you know, the work that I did was most directly related to the uh the revitalization of the YouTube channel and actually
Mm,
starting to use our YouTube channel
mm,
like a YouTube channel and not
yeah.
like a content repository. It was amazing. We had 46,000 followers and we were doing nothing with it. We were literally, we would do nothing. We'd have a conference, we'd dump, 50, 60, 100 videos up there. We'd have a few webinars that would make it up there as well from time to time. And like, that's it. Like, it was completely
Yeah.
neglected. Um, we gave it a lot of love. We tried to build a cadence for it. We tried to build like proper programming for it. Um, and a brand look, and try to bring the brand better into the channel. And in doing that, we more than doubled the subscriptions in 18 months. I think, we got um, uh, our tick mark, on the channel. We went over 100,000 subscribers. Some of that was also, the work that of a campaign that Christy Fedora led,
Mhm.
and put together. That we actually won a bronze medal, for the Digital Marketing Association Awards here in the UK, which was
Oh
kind of
wow.
cool. So that was the thing I was most directly related to. The podcast was 100% Josh Burke. It was something he was passionate, and it took him a while to make it happen, because retooling your work around a weekly cadence podcast, it was a hard
Oh
graft
yeah.
for him to make happen. And then the website revamp, while I did participate in that, that was actually led by Renee Winkelmeyer. Like, he was the one who did most of
Mm.
the work on that. And I can't, I can't mention like all that work we did in developer relations without also, talking about Christoph Kunratz, who was leading us, and still leads the team today.
Mm.
Um, you know, he was the one who set the vision for a lot of that and for where we were going as a team. Um, so where's developer content going today? Um, I have I have a hard time seeing it change vastly from a content delivery
Mm.
standpoint from what it is today. If you look at the landscape of what's out there, I think, to me, the medium that seems to be getting the most traction, across all media, is the format of basically a podcast that is also videoed and projected on YouTube for reach.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not just saying that to Glenn,
Yeah.
but you
Yes.
look at, I mean, media is in a really weird place. The
Mm.
thing that I wonder about and worry about, if anything, is that due to the decline of traditional media, such as newspapers, terrestrial slash, they're calling it, linear. broadcasting these
Yeah.
days, whether that's radio or television, the decimation of cable and satellite delivery of of your television signal, and where is all that going? That's all going onto the web. It's going through YouTube, through streaming services, and all of those
Mm,
things. Like, I have a little bit of a fear that the with the big fish sliding into the internet, it's going to crowd out sort of smaller grassroots content like this,
mm,
and make it harder for folks. If you look at the folks in the community, there like so many people. I can't even think of the names of all of them. Have done really great work on YouTube over the years, but certainly like Apex Hours is a really good example of that. Uh, Yeah, I'm trying to think of some other examples in the
yeah.
Salesforce community, but there are some folks out there doing that work. But if you take something like think of what David Liu did 10 years ago with the SFDC 99 initiative, or like what Salesforce Ben did from growing his, little blog to, kind of a media empire. Like, would it be, I wonder if it would be harder to do that given all of the other, um, the other, the other, uh, producers of content that are much
Yeah.
bigger, that have bigger pockets, that can afford to, buy more ads, that can afford to be more visible, like all of those things. And so I don't know, we'll see how that impact plays out, but it's something that I'm interested and curious about, and certainly concerned about, because most of the clients I work with in my private developer relations practice, I've started to build. The advisory work that I do, they rely on these for reaching their audience. I think the one thing where, as opposed to kind of sort of your typical consumer influencer type of work, that has to rely on sort of a consumer based social media, I think one saving grace that might exist is that a lot of promotion that, since the death of Twitter, um, a lot of the promotion that used to happen there has gone through LinkedIn. And
Mm,
because that is a social network that is business oriented, very clearly there is a huge there's a much stronger forcing function for people to behave and not troll.
yes.
And so I think that has made LinkedIn a haven for business and sort of work oriented content, which is the kind of stuff that you and I have done over the years. So I think that if any channel I think is going to stand to benefit in this style of content, I think it's going to be LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn's going to get a lot of revenue over the next few years,
Oh yeah.
um, because of the nature of their audience and the incentive that everybody has to behave themselves and not be jerks.
Yes, not going on there and saying what's first. And I mean, I've seen enough people go on there and post the first thing that comes into their mind, but often then regret it afterwards. It's no,
Right.
it is fascinating because I agree with what you're saying about the. I think as more media moves online, there's a thing. One of the interesting things I find about it is is when I first started blogging and doing things in Salesforce, it was a lot easier, I found, to get a lot of traction quickly because of it was mainly blogging. Like the first few videos
Mhm.
I did on this channel got a decent hit rate and okay-ish numbers, but probably better numbers than I get for these things now
Yeah, yeah.
because there was so few things out there. But also, you could write a blog, you proofread it, you might add a couple of pictures if you were really feeling fancy, and then you
Mhm.
published it.
Yeah.
And that was the primary consumption channel for people. Nowadays, when you're producing a video, I mean, this video is pretty easy and kind of okay in terms of production value because it's we've both got decent HD cameras and we've got decent microphones because we're used to streaming and things.
Right.
Um, But if I want to produce a video that's, and when we do our live streams, you and I are good with the rough and ready format because we kind of want it to be raw and real, and
Yeah,
that's a
yeah.
live stream. That's the point of a live stream.
And the audience, I think, is less bothered by
I
that.
think, well, I
You
think
know,
they want it in some instances. They want to see you and me think through things. That's why you're going.
yeah, and I guess when I say that, I mean like production values, for
Yeah,
example. Like, you don't need a highly produced piece of content to help somebody solve a problem, in this way. You can do it and it doesn't hurt, provided it doesn't hurt, like
yeah.
provided you focus on the message and not, you're not overly concerned about the those production values, or the marketing side.
What's
Um,
his That's one of the things I think is actually one of the challenges now, because if I now try and produce content for,
mhm,
say, I'm doing a book review.
yeah,
There is an editor I work with who edits those book reviews together to just kind of make them flow a little bit easier. Just to have some transitions, have some iconography, and which I don't have the time to learn and do.
right,
But if I
right,
was
right.
trying to do something like a learning Apex video series, like that's something I feel I've got a good amount of experience and even
Yeah,
some published books on learning Apex. I could help people, but it's the level of production values for me to go. And I'm just going to use the Salesforce Ben team as an example. We were in their offices the other week doing a
yeah,
live
yeah,
stream.
yep,
They've got a really snazzy good setup because that's their kind of core thing. And I think that there is a thing where for some of us, it's, if you were starting out now and didn't have any audience, I think getting the level of production and quality right to do that, getting the cadence right to do that, getting the
yeah,
and being able to do the reach for it is really, really tough. And I can completely see why there is a concern I have that it's going to be harder for people to share. What I loved about Salesforce when I first joined was how easy it was for people to share and
yeah,
get knowledge of each other's stuff. And I think that's becoming harder and harder.
yep, yeah. The other aspect of that I just want to focus on, if you zero in, so that's just broadly like how is, let's call it business focused content,
Yes.
going to progress, from a content delivery standpoint. Like, that'd be
Mm.
my take. But, let's zero in on Salesforce. And this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to over the last year. Um, and I want to say this with, all of the respect and the understanding of what it means to be a developer relations team
Hmm.
for a large software company that has very clear and very specific goals that have been laid out for it, which is the case with Salesforce Developer Relations. What I don't see today coming from Salesforce is good, free, publicly available, get started on Salesforce content. I
Mm.
mean, yeah, you can go back through the back library and there's plenty of that stuff, but I don't know that I would want somebody who is brand new to Salesforce today to watch a, 30 minutes get started with Apex webinar from 5 years ago. There probably would be some good overlap, but at the same time, the platform has moved on, the context of the platform has moved on.
Yeah.
Um, the priorities of Salesforce and, how you implement that, and Agent Force is definitely here. Uh,
So agent
a,
what? I'm not.
agentic AI is definitely a thing, and the way that large language models and generative AI are going to transform software, like that's going to be a thing. I don't know that any of us knows exactly what it's going to look like yet, but it's definitely on its way.
Yeah.
So, what it means to work with Salesforce, if Salesforce still exists in 5 years, let's say, and I say that only, not prognosticating, but only because like it's software, like people
It's
get
okay.
acquired, stuff
New
happens.
tagline. Peter Chittum says Salesforce won't be here in 5 years' time.
But so in 5 years it might be totally different as far as what it looks like to be a developer using the Salesforce
Yeah.
platform, which is fine. But today, uh, you know, you need to be able to write an Apex class, you need to understand what an Apex trigger is. You need to understand how to call that Apex class from different parts of the Salesforce stack, whether that's a flow or a Lightning Web Component or scheduled or an API invocation. Um, you know, I I see the developer relations team today being 100% focused on making sure that all of us are as successful as we can be with Agentforce today.
Mm.
Um, in the absence of that, I would say there's a vacuum. And that's where I think content creators like yourself, I think, possibly Salesforce Ben, I would love to see an ISV that has sort of a developer focused mindset step up and, regardless of like what they do and what their developer tool is, just to step up and start to do like a Salesforce basics series. I think you could get a lot of traction. Let's say if you were one of the big DevOps providers for Salesforce,
Mm.
um, you know, if you wanted developers to want and use your platform, I could totally see like, you know, creating a 10-part Get Started with Apex series, on, your YouTube channel. And if you get developers who, focus it on an audience of developers who are um, uh, experienced in software development but new to Salesforce,
Yeah.
you would think that that would be really good content to get them interested in your brand, right? Like
Mm.
that is pure developer relations right there, where it's like, show me something that's useful and tell me why I should pay attention to you. It may not be exactly what your product is, but by virtue of you educating me, you're gonna build goodwill with me as a developer. And when I go and kind of make a choice the next time I have to make a choice that's related to what your product is, I'm probably gonna think about you a little bit harder than I did before. Like so I feel like there is a huge opportunity for more um, non-agent force developer focused learning content for everybody in the ecosystem who's doing it. Mostly because Salesforce developer relations doesn't seem to be doing that right now.
I'd like to. I completely agree with that 100%. It's one of those things that is very much you as you know, as you and I chat, not always on a often on a camera with a microphone, but not always being recorded.
Yeah.
Peter and I don't record every single one of our conversations. I promise. It's a thing that I definitely think about. I'd like to actually say more broadly than that. I don't think that's just a developer relations problem. I think that's a Salesforce problem. And what I mean by that is, if you were to look at, say you've just purchased Sales Cloud, where do you go for like the basic Sales Cloud setup? Where do you go for the basic Service Cloud setup? I think there's a huge gap in that in general. So, and
That's interesting.
it's
So would you say in saying that like, because I think the fallback from somebody from Salesforce would be, well, just go to Trailhead.
I think that the Trailhead is new time. Paul slams Trailhead. No, Trailhead is very, and I've been very public on my views on Trailhead. I think Trailhead is very good for very shallow. Like
Mhm.
there's very few modules where you go in and you come out of it. It's not designed for you to be an expert in something.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I once calculated, in fact, as a fun side story, that you could become a ranger without actually doing a single module that was related to Salesforce. Like you could get 100 badges at one point by doing
Wow.
like fourth industrial revolution and healthy eating.
Would you
And
have enough points?
I I assume, well, at the time when I did it, you didn't
Okay,
need, there was like different thresholds, I think, or different
okay.
number of points. But either way,
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
fact that you could get, let's say the fact that you could get a good portion of the way there and like have done all this Salesforce learning and just know how, what healthy eating is, and you know about mindfulness, and all important things. Let's be clear, but not exactly what a client is going to be paying you for.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
so Trailhead's really good for so many things, but it's where I point people to say, go and read that to get. And how I use it is, I just want to get a quick overview of it, and then what I'll go do is I'll read the documentation. I
Yeah.
think if you're someone looking to implement it, how do you set up lead assignment rules? How do you set up a permission set? And Salesforce will go through those things in a certain level. But what I think is really needed is okay, you've just got Salesforce. Here's how you go and set up lead assignment. And what we're going to do is show you an example use case, build it through, and show you it working. And it's a 10-15 minute video, and bang. And I will be very open here and say it's the sort of video content I am looking at
Mhm.
as to think about how to do it, because I think there is just that gap for a certain amount of people using Salesforce that, yeah, everyone wants to do Einstein agents and service, agent force, whatever it might be. But, I want to go and set up, I want to turn on omni-channel. What does that mean? You've got to turn on messaging for in-app and web for you to use agent force.
Mhm.
What does messaging for in-app and web mean? What does what does that actually involve you
Right.
doing? You have
Right.
to have what is an omni-channel flow? What do all these things mean that you can have a video on? So yeah, I think it's a broader Salesforce problem where, and I get why they're pushing what they have to push is the new stuff, and it's also a new pricing model for them, and they're
Yeah.
trying to
And
make
I
sure that
think I think a lot of Salesforce customers are really gonna struggle with, pricing per usage. Usage-based
yeah.
pricing is just such a different paradigm than, the thousands of Salesforce customers have been used to for 20 some odd years, right? So it's gonna be hard.
It's gonna be hard for enterprises in particular. And what I mean
Yeah.
by I there was one customer I worked with a few years ago who um I when you are running a consulting partner, one of the jobs you are often involved in is going into a customer and helping them and helping the Salesforce AE and helping the customer come together in the right way to sort out their licenses. Because
Right.
often I'll go into an org and I'll be like, why have you got 50 inbox licenses? You don't need them. And often one of the things I would do is spend time drawing out a roadmap with the customer, especially if they know they're growing or they've just got investment or whatever. And there was this one customer who went from 100 people to 450 people whilst I was working with them over a 2 year period. They just
Mhm.
massive growth. And I renegotiated their license deal with Salesforce, with them working it, and it was like a couple of thousand. It was a couple of million over the few years, like the license deal. It was a huge thing, but like that was really good for the customer because they were able to sit there and go, I know every year in my budget, I need to circle this number of pennies and put them aside
Right.
for
Right.
Salesforce. And like
Right.
when you're sitting there on a board and going up to your parent company or your investors and being like, right, we've agreed to go to Salesforce. We're going to spend 3 million over the next 3 years. Here's the breakdown of it. Here's what our licenses look like. And to what you're saying, here's how it feeds into our headcount
Right.
and our growth plans. That's perfect. If you go through and say like, right, it's going to cost us $2 a conversation. Well, how many conversations are we going to have? Like, I don't know.
Good
Like,
question.
yeah, and we've all spent enough time trying to get case data like organized and figured out to kind of figure that out.
Mhm.
And yeah, so I agree with that. I think it's going to be an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tangent, but I was just starting to read an article. I haven't read it yet, but RedMonk, which is a sort of developer-focused analyst that
Mm.
they're very active in the developer relations community. Salesforce is a customer, but they just did a comparison of agent and agentic AI-based pricing, and I
Oh,
forget the
cool.
model that most companies are using, but it isn't just a pure. Oh no, it's like a per token based pricing is what most companies using. So I think it's gonna be really interesting to watch and see. Like with Salesforce saying per conversation, that leaves a lot of space in there to say, like, well, per conversation, how many tokens are you
Yeah,
expecting in that conversation? Because that's a big gray area. And Salesforce has done this successfully before. I mean, the
yeah,
pricing for storage is based on record and this estimate of how many kilobytes per record, a record costs, no matter how many fields are on it. So clearly Salesforce have managed to hedge this in the past, where they kind of have this sort of hand wavy, like, here's
Yeah.
what we're going to call like what is it, kilobytes, right?
It's 2 well, do you know where that comes from?
Well, it's 2 kilobytes per record for all objects except for campaigns, I think. It's like one
No.
weird one.
No, there's cases, but it's changed. That rule changed.
Oh,
So
did it?
the original ruling on it was 2 kilobytes per record,
Yeah.
for up to as many fields as you needed. And the reason being is because obviously in the background, it didn't matter if you had like 4 fields or 400 fields or whatever, you had the same row in the Oracle database because it was all
Right.
in one shared
Yeah.
table.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So that was where it came from, because it was the actual Oracle storage.
Yeah.
That changed.
Ostensibly, though, like, if you're using all 800 fields, you're still storing more data than if you're not, right?
Yeah. Well. So this is where it broke. It broke when they added in the email message object, and when they added in rich text and long text fields, because
Okay.
they store more
Yeah.
data. So one of the things that you will notice if you go into many an org is their data storage is massively skewed, and it's because they've got email messages. I posted this story a while ago, but I had a client where it was last year. I posted this story about a client I helped archive 15 million emails, and we took them off platform onto a Heroku database. And so the email message records we copied across using Heroku Connect, and then we re-exposed them using external objects. And I deleted 15 million emails. And I can tell you that I have never, ever in my life been more nervous. Like, I was sat in this office and we started
That's
the
a lot
run,
of emails.
and I was just sat there like, but like literally, and do you know what? It ran in like 5 hours. It was really quick copying
Wow.
and deleting. Like, it was performant beyond belief. But let's just say I had 5 hours where the chair that I was sat on slowly got sweatier and sweatier, and like I couldn't eat. I went back to the hotel I was staying in that night. I didn't eat anything after lunch that day, because I was like, I'm gonna throw up if this goes wrong. And like we'd done all the right things. We had backups in place and everything else, but
Still.
the fear was there.
Oh
Anyway,
my God, yeah. Anyway, so it's a bit of a tangent, but I just like I feel like the die isn't quite cast
yeah,
yet,
yeah,
or may not yet be cast on this whole pricing thing with Salesforce. So, but
interesting.
yeah,
Is that the
so if you're listening and you like have any kind of like desire to create content, go find a way to do that,
yeah?
because probably the thing that you just learned today, somebody else will benefit from. Go share it at your developer group or your local user group. YouTube channels are super easy to stand up, and it's not that hard to do a screen recording, relatively cheaply. Both Windows and Mac have utilities that are built in or free for you to do that with.
Oh
You
yeah,
need a little bit of editing software, but you can be really minimalist at it. Don't get hung up on the tool chain. Just go
no,
do it. And I finally started my own blog after not having one for like 10 years. And I just decided the most simple way to do it is this blogging platform called Metaroa, which is open source and bans any kind of SEO based formatting or structure. So it's literally just meant to go be creative, go write something and share. So
okay,
yeah,
cool. Because I use
Metaroa.
yeah, I'm not. I'm terrible at blogging because I have Medium and I have a blog that I just haven't updated in ages. But anyway,
Yeah.
um, that's all. That is all extremely interesting. And to reiterate what Peter said, like if you are trying to get started on things, like feel free to reach out to myself or Peter if
Or
you're like,
me.
hey, I've got this idea, yep, and you just want to chat or figure out how you get started. Like, would love
Do you
to help.
want me to read a blog post before you
Yeah,
post it? You want to run a talk that you want to do by me? Like, my door is open. I'm always helpful. I always want to help folks who are, especially if you're trying to get started and you need someone kind of in your corner.
yeah,
Like, I've mentored probably hundreds of people into, going up there and giving their first talk or presenting their first class, and, happy to help out.
yeah. No, I appreciate that offer to everyone, and also, if you are publishing something that you think's new and interesting, let me know. And like, we have the Cloud Bytes weekly newsletter. it can get added to that. I love adding stuff in there and having people share things. So we have covered a lot today, Peter,
Yeah.
in 2 hours and what is now about 2 hours 20 minutes. So
Probably long enough.
yes, probably long enough for people to
I can't
for
wait
this
to see the YouTube like stats on this one. It's going to be like,
10 minutes drop off. Yes. Um, so we've covered a lot of things. At the moment, I know you're kind of out as well doing your own independent developer relations consulting as well. So
yeah,
if you are a company looking for some advice on developer relations and developer advocacy, and developer evangelism, please go and reach out to Peter. He is fantastic. And you can see on his LinkedIn a bunch of the companies he's working with at the moment on a
yeah.
number of different things.
I'd say my sweet spot is really like if you have a marketer that is like, or you want to hire your first developer relations person, or if you have a marketer who's leading a developer relations team, like I tend like that seems to be where I'm finding a really strong niche as far as where my skills lie is kind of being that sort of expert in the field of developer relations that I can go and kind of help enable a team go and rock on with it. So that's where I seem to have been fitting in really well.
Perfect. So yeah, if you're looking for someone in that area, hit Pete up. So we have covered today a lot of stuff, as we say, from you getting started, from kind of your background in the theatre through going customer support, learning Salesforce, learning development, moving into evangelism, your rise up the ranks of evangelism,
You're
your
making me feel old, man. So
yeah. Do you remember when you had the very first computer that you were working on? You were the first person ever to do that. But so we've covered a lot, and talking about how content's created now, how content is coming out in the future, and how people should look at it. One of the things I like to finish off every episode with is a piece of advice or a tip that you would give someone listening to this to help them in their career. Just to help them, really. I mean, and there's a bunch of things I think we've covered up already, like just saying yes to things and trying things, being more open, not being dogmatic, and kind of being pragmatic, and making sure that you have a defined level of what good is for you, and you're giving yourself the time to practice for it, giving yourself a little bit of free reign so that you know that things can go wrong and you don't beat yourself too much over it. Those are a few off the getting started with blogging or podcasting or videos. So we've got a bunch of tips there. Is there anything? Is there another tip that you would like to add, or one of those in particular you would like to say to people? This is the one thing I would say. Other than remembering to subscribe to this
yeah,
YouTube channel and to hit like on this and to come along to the live streams.
yeah, that's a really good question. The first thought that came to my head was something along the lines of, you know, find and build empathy. Um, I don't think that that's a skill that can be underestimated,
Hmm.
no matter what you do for work. And I think people do this better maybe in person, which is why it's all the more important in this super online connected world where,
Yeah.
like I've maybe seen you twice in the last year in person, but like dozens of times, um, you know,
Yeah.
virtually. And it's so much easier, I think, to slag people off and to kind of have an attitude and to and like one principle that I've always tried to apply to myself is when I'm writing an email, expect that everyone is going to think the worst possible thing of whatever I'm
Mm.
writing, and at the same time whenever I'm reading one, always try and think of the best possible motivations for that person. So I do think empathy is a skill that is especially needed today, but I think even more than that, um find out what works for you. And once you've started to do that, like really find ways um, to build your belief in that and to go in that direction. Um, because I do think we live in a world where everybody's got a system or a structure or um, you know, a set of rules that you need to follow, or that they say is going to solve this or that problem. And you know, and it's not to say that you can't like find one, and go with it, but like, you know, find the one that does, I guess is the thing. So, for example, when I was getting ready to leave Salesforce, I've not made a secret of this. I was made redundant. It's part of the big redundancy that happened in early 2023. And it wasn't what I had planned to do. It was I had other ideas, and it was actually ramping up for some things I thought were going to be exciting the coming year. Um, I read this book called Ikigai,
Yeah.
and uh, and there's this sort of structure that it has about find the thing that the world needs, and that you are good at, and that you love to do, and that or that you at least like to do. And there's another. It's based on the fourth thing, but anyway, so and that mindset really worked for me to focus on what I was going to do next. In a time where, even still today, like the job market is like, it's really rocky, and it's not really obvious for someone to just go off. 3 years ago, you could expect that, you'd get lots of job offers for
Mm.
anything, anytime you were looking for something. And these days it's just very different. Everybody's saying so. So I'd say, yeah, find the thing that works for you for as long as it works, and just invest your time and energy in that. And I think that's better than just find what you love.
Yeah.
Because I mean, if you find it and you can make money at it, that's great. But that doesn't, life just doesn't always work that way. But,
No.
you know, certainly if you're finding something that really doesn't work for you, find a way to exit that. We're not all privileged that we can just sort of walk away when something stops working. But if you really sincerely feel like, you're coming to the end with something, you know, start doing the work, and, find alternatives. There's always an alternative out there.
Mm. No, that makes perfect sense. That's a great tip. So thank you, Pete. Thank you for another 2 hours and 20 something odd minutes of your time. Um,
Well, we did
and
say, both of us, like, okay, we're not gonna have any problem finding things to talk about during this session.
exactly.
So yeah.
No, and this is what I love about these podcasts, these conversations is, as you say, like you and I speak to each other every 2 weeks. We live stream together. We sort of are chatting throughout that time about odds and sods and random things we're working on. Anyway, like but one of the things I really loved that we did before Christmas was when we did the live stream in person,
Hmm.
and we just had a couple of drinks afterwards. Me, you, and Emily just kind of shooting the breeze and
Yeah.
chatting. So yeah, and this is what I love about these things is that I've learned a bunch about you today. That despite the fact we've known each other for
Over
years,
a decade. Yeah.
yeah, over a decade for definite, like I didn't know, or I may have known and forgotten, and
Yeah.
just always good to learn. So thank you so much for coming on and for sharing with everyone.
Yeah, well, thank you too, and for being such a gracious host. And kind of, I think, uh, this podcast, it's definitely filling a space out there that's giving voice to people who just are coming and sharing about like their journey through this sort of weird technology space that we all sort of occupy. So yeah, thank you.
No, thanks. So thank you everyone at home for listening or watching. Please remember, if you're not already, to subscribe. If you're on YouTube, you can subscribe and make sure you can see myself and whoever we have on next on the videos. Please give it a like as well and leave a comment below on what you've enjoyed, or if there's a particular person you'd love me to speak to. If you're listening, again, please remember to subscribe and drop a like or leave a review for us, as it really helps. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you again, Peter, for having us here. And I will catch up with everyone on the next one.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.